Please be seated. I was supposed to marry a cousin of mine in another state. And so for clergy, the Episcopal clergy, in order to do that in another state, you have to seek permission from the bishop of that diocese. So happened my cousin was divorced. And so I called the diocesan office, left the message for the bishop, and I'm not criticizing him, but it took him almost a week to get back to me. He calls me, which I appreciated very much, and I explained to him the situation, and he said, oh, okay, if she was divorced before, I will send you a link with all the documents she had to file for me to give her permission to get remarried. And I immediately looked up in the skies and thought, okay, thank you. And so he did. It took 2 days for the paperwork to get to me, because they are busy. When I looked at the paperwork, I sent it over to my cousin, and I said, fill as much as you can. And she took her like a day or so, and then she came back to me and says, I'm going to hire an officiant. You can rent the priest now for kind of $50 an hour or something like that for a wedding. We think we go cheap in the market. So I said, I understand perfectly well, because this thing was like several pages long. When you see the bishop was going to base his decision whether to approve the marriage or not based on me exclusively, because he doesn't know that. But he had to fulfill certain rules and requirements of the church. And then I start thinking, Jesus did not write a book. We don't have a book from Jesus. We don't have the equivalent of the Quran. We don't. We have the New Testament, which some people think it might have been written by Jesus, but I assure you, it had nothing to do with that. Although he could write, we know that. And he could read, we know that. But he, for some reasons, was not interested in leaving us a book. Nor he ever built a building to house his community and his church. And he never, for sure, created an institution. We did that. So I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? I heard Presiding Bishop the other day asking for creating what he called the Jesus movement within the Episcopal Church. And then I realized that the church, the institutional church, and the movement of Jesus are not necessarily coterminous. They are not the same thing. Sometimes the movement of Jesus survives within the institution, and sometimes thrives within the institution, and sometimes gets beaten down within the institution. You see, Jesus taught mostly telling stories, some of which were completely fictional, which we call parables. And he also taught with something extremely powerful, is he taught with his example. If I remind you the story of the child when he says, let the children come to me, what he does, he calls a child, brings him among them, and he performs a parable instead of just telling it. Jesus did not ask people to come to him, he went to people. He went to the places, the marketplace and other places where they met, and they engaged them in conversation. So what happened was that people who had started following him from place to place started talking to each other, and a movement was born. Jesus is preaching about God, his Father, in a nation who is supposed to, all by itself, honor his Father. It's a nation that has been the chosen people, and therefore he is among his own. That nation on the first century was 90% probably made of peasants. Peasants who either worked for somebody else or own land, and they had to pay rent to a landowner. So they will rent a piece of land, and they will take care of that land and pay then the landowner. And that's what you hear stories about Jesus having, about the tenants of the land. A lot of people were tenants because they didn't own the land. So these people live what is called an economy of subsistence, which means that sometimes when the sun is setting is when you find out if you're going to eat that day. You and your family. Because you see, farming is really unreliable. You can never think how farming is going to go in any particular circumstance. Plus the prices of the market. So you can take some of the stuff and sell it in the market, but you don't know how much money it's going to fetch. So until the peasant went home, his family was not certain if they were going to eat that day. There was not a lot of money lying around. A peasant had to have seeds to plant for the next year, and he has to have some reserve to pay a number of taxes. He had to pay the rent for the land, he had to pay taxes to a local government, has to pay taxes to the beloved emperor, Roman emperor, who was invading their own land. Then the peasant has to have money to fulfill social obligations, which mostly were religious. So the peasant has to, as I said, pay the temple tax, but at the same time has to pay for things that happen in his life. If the peasant, for instance, instead of having a son, had the misfortune of having a daughter, has to pay for her to get married. And I use misfortune sarcastically, as you know. So it was not an easy life. There was a life under a lot of pressure. There was nothing left around. So mostly the time, by the time the peasants were finished the day, they were just exhausted and they had no energy for anything else except going to bed and sleep and get up early next day in the morning. Meanwhile, religion has become extremely complicated. Religion professionals like myself in those days complicated religion to extents that we have no idea really today. By the 2nd century, there were 613 commandments that you had to fulfill to have a good relationship with God. 613. I don't even remember them. I have looked at them and studied them. I can't remember them. There are too many. About half of them were negative and half of them were positive. That didn't help at all. But in order to have a good relationship with God, you had to know them and fulfill them. Of course, a person, as I described, a peasant who was just laboring day to day, trying to get their family ahead, didn't have time even to remember what commandments to fulfill and do. So when he had a question about commandment, because it was very important for the Jews, if you were wealthy and you were healthy, you were blessed by God. If you were sick and you were poor, you were cursed by God. On the basis of either you committed a sin that nobody knew about, or your parents or your ancestors committed a sin for which you had to pay. If you remember the story of the man born blind, the disciples' first question they asked Jesus is, this man was born blind because his parents sinned or because he sinned? Because of course he was born blind. So they had to speculate about why was he born blind. He was not born, it was born blind, was already punished, and therefore why is he punished? Must be because of his ancestors did something. And if you remember, the parents of the man born blind, immediately when he regained his sight, throw him under the bus. They said, he's an adult, he can answer by himself. We have nothing to do with this. We don't know the guy who healed him. So it was clear for the Jewish people that your condition of life was connected directly to the blessings God had heaped upon you. And therefore, if you're not doing well, if you were poor, if you were unhealthy for whatever reason, was because you had done something wrong. So having a right relationship with God was very important for the Jewish people. But they have these hoops they had to jump over in order to have a good relationship with God. And who determined if you had a good relationship with God was the professional religious people. People of the temple, people of the, what I call lawyers, the lawyers of the religious law. And if you were in doubt, you had to go and consult them, and you had to pay for the services. And you know, lawyers had never been cheap. Now we're in the first century. So Jesus comes into a world in which the religion of his father has become a very complex edifice with so many little curves and so much paperwork to fill for a wedding that sometimes just people did the same thing as my cousin did. Just throw her arms up in the air and rent the priest for an hour. And so that brings me to my point. Today we have heard what we call the summary of the law, which are actually 2 pegs. Think about what you have that behind your door in your bedroom. At least I have behind my door in the bedroom. I have one for my house coat. So when I get in the morning, buck naked, because that's how I sleep, I have to put that on because otherwise I will freeze. And then I have the last shirt I used next to it. So Jesus is saying, from these 2 pegs hang all the law and the prophets. Everything depends on these 2 pegs. And for a person who is listening to this, his eyes are to open wide. Because you see, having a good relationship with God, in their mind thought, it made them think that they will then improve their own conditions of life. So he says the only thing you need to do is to love God, to love your neighbor, and to love yourself. Simple. You don't have to remember anything. Love God, love neighbor, and love self. And I think Jesus, this is the core of his ministry, in which he made the religion of his father available to all. Regardless of your education or regardless of the time you have. And I think in a world like today, this is mighty important. The other day I went to a bar's bathroom, and men have urinals. So I'm in my urinal, and I see in front of me this little sign telling me what they are selling somewhere. And I'm thinking, not even in the urinal have a place where I can hide from information. Information is getting to us everywhere, even in men's urinals. And I was thinking I could put the program for the fall and winter here in the urinals down there. I all of a sudden had that idea. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. It's very tempting, but I'm not going to do that. We are overwhelmed with information constantly. When we go to work, the market requires from us not just our energy, physical and emotional and creative juices, they want the whole thing. They want, when you leave your office or your place of employment, you end up going home completely dry of anything. You don't want to be even with your family because you have no energy for them at that end of the day. So in a way, we are not as poor as the tenants of the first century, but we are as exhausted as they were at the end of the day. And then we have this religion who is so simple, who is based on love. And we all, even at the end of the day when we're exhausted, we want to have some love. And at the end of the day, the only thing we need to do to be in a good relationship with the Lord is to love God, to love your neighbor, and to love yourself.